everybody, welcome back to my channel, ASMR Sleep Z. My name is Mel, and we are reading another classic tale of Christmas. If you're interested in this book, you can find a link to it in the description below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this series of whispered Christmas tales. Right now I'll pin the playlist for this book in case you haven't seen it yet. Let's get started on the second part of the Nutcracker. We ended right about here, and I've put the marker for where we will end for this video. Alright, let's go. The battle. Beat the march, true Vassal drummer, screamed Nutcracker very loudly and skillfully, that the windows of the glass case trembled and hummed again. Now it rustled and clattered therein, and Maria perceived that the covers of the little boxes in which Fred's army were quartered were bursting open. And now the soldiers leapt out and then down again upon the lowest shelf, where they drew up in fine array. Nutcracker ran up and down, speaking inspiring words to the troops. "Let no dog of a trumpeter blow or stir," he cried angrily, for he was afraid he should not be heard, and then turned quickly to Harlequin, who had grown a little pale and chattered with his long chin. "General," he said earnestly, "I know your courage and your experience. There is need now for a quick eye and skill to seize the proper moment. I entrust to your command all the cavalry and artillery. You do not need a horse, for you have very long legs and can gallop yourself tolerably well. I look to see you do your duty." Thereupon Harlequin put his long, thin fingers to his mouth and crowed so piercingly that it sounded as if 100 shell trumpeters were blown merrily. Then it stirred again in the glass case. A neighing and a whinnying and a stamping were heard, and see, Fred's cuirassiers and dragoons, but above all, his new splendid hussars marched out and halted close by the case. Regiment after regiment now defiled before Nutcracker with flying colors and warlike music, and ranged themselves in long rows across the floor of the chamber. Before them went Fred's cannon rattling along, surrounded by the cannoneers, and soon bom-bom it went, and Maria could see how the mice suffered by the fire, how the sugar plums plunged into their dark heavy mass, covering them with white powder, and throwing them more than once into shameful disorder. But the greatest damage was done them by a heavy battery that was mounted upon Mamma's footstool, which, pum-pum, kept up a steady fire of caraway seeds against the enemy, by which a great many of them fell. The mice, notwithstanding, came nearer and nearer, and at last mastered some of the cannon, but then it went purr-purr, and Maria could scarcely see what now happened for the smoke and dust. This, however, was certain, that each corpse fought with the greatest animosity, and the victory was for a long time doubtful. The mice kept deploying more and more forces, and the little silver shot, which they fired very skillfully, struck now even into the glass case. Clara and Trudchen ran around in despair. "Must I die in the blossom of youth?" asked Clara. "Have I so well preserved myself for this, to perish here in these walls?" cried Trudchen. Then they fell about each other's necks and screamed so terribly that they could be heard above the mad tumult of the battle. Of the scene that now presented itself, you can have no idea, good reader. It went purr-purr, puff-piff, glitter-clatter, bum-brum, bum-brum, bum, in the wildest confusion, while the Mouse King and mice squeaked and screamed, and now and then the mighty voice of Nutcracker was heard, as he gave the necessary orders, and he was seen striding along through the battalions in the hottest of the fire. Harlequin had made some splendid charges with his cavalry and covered himself with honor, but Fred's hussars were battered by the enemy's artillery with odious offensive balls which made dreadful spots in their red jackets, for which reason they would not move forward. Harlequin ordered them to draw off to the left, and in the enthusiasm of command headed the movement himself, and the cuirassiers and dragoons followed. That is, they all drew off to the left and galloped home. By this step the battery upon the footstool was exposed to great danger, and it was not long before a strong body of very ugly mice pushed on with such determined bravery that the footstool, cannons, cannoneers, and all were overthrown by their headlong charge. Nutcracker seemed a little disturbed at this and gave orders that the right wing should make a retreating movement. You know very well, O my military reader Frederick, that to make such a movement is almost the same thing as to run away. And you are now grieving with me at the disaster which impends over the army of Maria's darling Nutcracker. But turn your eyes from this scene and view the left wing, where all is still in good order, and where there is yet great hope, both for the general and the army. During the hottest of the fight, large masses of mice cavalry had debouched softly from under the settee, and amid loud and hideous squeaking, had thrown themselves with fury upon the left wing. But what an obstinate resistance did they meet with there! Slowly, as the difficult nature of the ground required, for the edge of the glass case had to be traversed, the china figures had advanced, headed by 2 Chinese emperors, and formed themselves into a hollow square. These brave, motley, but noble troops which were composed of gardeners, Tyrolese, bonzes, friseurs, merry andrews, cupids, lions, tigers, peacocks, and apes, fought with coolness, courage, and determination. By their Spartan bravery, this battalion of picked men would have wrested the victory from the foe, had not a bold major rushed madly from the enemy's ranks and bitten off the head of one of the Chinese emperors, who in falling dashed to the ground 2 bonzes and a cupid. Through this gap the enemy penetrated into the square, and in a few moments the whole battalion was torn to pieces. Their brave resistance, therefore, was of no avail to Nutcracker's army, which, once having begun to retreat, retired farther and farther, and at every step with diminished numbers, until the unfortunate Nutcracker halted with a little band close before the glass case. Let the reserve advance. Harlequin, Scaramouche, Drummer, where are you? Thus cried Nutcracker, in hopes of new troops which should deploy out of the glass case, and there actually came forth a few brown men and women made of sweet thorn, with golden faces and caps and helmets. But they fought around so awkwardly that they did not hit one of the enemy, and at last knocked the cap off their own general's head. The enemy's chasseurs, too, bit off their legs before long, so that they tumbled over, and carried with them to the ground some of the Nutcracker's best officers. Nutcracker, now completely surrounded by the foe, was in the greatest peril. He tried to leap over the edge into the glass case, but found his legs too short. Clara and Trudgeon lay each in a deep swoon. They could not help him. Hussar's dragoons sprang merrily by him into safe quarters, and in wild despair he cried, "A horse, a horse! A kingdom for a horse!" At this moment, 2 of the enemy's tirailleurs, I don't know how to say that, tirailleurs, seized him by his wooden mantle, and the Mouse King, squeaking from his 7 throats, leaped in triumph towards him. Maria could no longer control herself. "Oh, my poor Nutcracker," she cried, sobbing. and without being exactly conscious of what she did, grasped her left shoe and threw it with all her strength into the thickest of the mice, straight at their king. In an instant, all seemed scattered and dispersed, but Maria felt in her left arm a still sharper pain than before, and sank in a swoon to the floor. The sickness. When Maria woke out of her deep and death-like slumber, she found herself lying in her own bed, with the sun shining bright and sparkling through the ice-covered windows into the chamber. Close beside her sat a stranger, whom she soon recognized, however, as the surgeon Wendelstern. He said softly, "She is awake." Her mother then came to the bedside and gazed upon her with anxious and inquiring looks. "Ah, dear mother," lisped little Maria, "are all the hateful mice gone, and is the good Nutcracker safe?" "Do not talk such foolish stuff," replied her mother. "What have the mice to do with Nutcracker? You naughty child, you have caused us a great deal of anxiety. But so it always is when children are disobedient and do not mind their parents. You played last night with your dolls until it was very late. You became sleepy, probably, and a stray mouse may have jumped out and frightened you. At all events, you broke a pane of glass with your elbow and cut your arm so severely that neighbor Wendelstern, who has just taken the piece of glass out of the wound, declares that it became very near cutting a vein, in which case you might have had a stiff arm all your life, or perhaps have bled to death. It was fortunate that I awoke about midnight, and not finding you in your bed, got up and went into the sitting room. There you lay in a swoon upon the floor, close by the glass case, the blood flowing in a stream. I almost fainted away myself at the sight. There you lay, and scattered around were many of Frederick's leaden soldiers, broken china figures, gingerbread men and women, and other playthings, and not far off your left shoe." "Ah, dear mother," exclaimed Maria, interrupting her. "Those were the traces of that dreadful battle between the puppets and the mice, and what frightened me so was the danger of poor Nutcracker, when the mice were going to take him prisoner. And then I threw my shoe at the mice, and after that I don't know what happened." Surgeon Wendelstern here made a sign to the mother, and she said very softly to Maria, "Well, never mind about it, my dear child. The mice are all gone, and little Nutcracker stands safe and sound in the glass case." Dr. Stahlbaum now entered the chamber and spoke for a while with Surgeon Wendelstern. Then he felt Maria's pulse, and she could hear very plainly that he said something about a fever. She was obliged to remain in bed and take physic. And so it continued for some days, although except a slight pain in her arm, she felt quite well and comfortable. She knew little Nutcracker had escaped safe from the battle, and it seemed to her that she sometimes heard his voice quite plainly, as if in a dream, saying mournfully, "Maria, dearest lady, what thanks do I not owe you? But you can do still more for me." Maria tried to think what it could be, but in vain. Nothing occurred to her. She could not play very well on account of the wound in her arm, and when she tried to read or look at her picture books, a strange glare came across her eyes, so that she was obliged to desist. The time during the day always seemed very long to her. She waited impatiently for evening, as her mother then usually seated herself by her bedside and read or related some pretty story to her. One evening she had just finished the wonderful history of Prince Facardine, when the door opened, and Godfather Drosselmeyer entered, saying, "I must see now for myself how it goes with the sick and wounded Maria." As soon as Maria saw Godfather Drosselmeyer in his brown coat, The image of that night in which Nutcracker lost the battle against the mice returned vividly to her mind, and she cried out involuntarily, "Oh, Godfather Drosselmeyer, you have been very naughty. I saw you as you sat upon the clock, and covered it with your wings, so that it should not strike loud to scare away the mice. I heard how you called out to the Mouse King. Why did you not come to help us, me and the poor Nutcracker? It is all your fault, naughty Godfather Drosselmeyer, that I must be here, sick in bed." Her mother was quite frightened at this, and said, "What is the matter with you, dear Maria?" But Godfather Drosselmeyer made very strange faces, and said in a grating, monotonous tone, "Pendulum must whir, 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 this way, that way, clock will strike, tired of ticking all the day, softly whir, 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 strike, cling, clang, strike, clang, cling, bing and bang and bang and bing, 'twill scare away the Mouse King. Then owl in swift flight comes at dead of night, pendulum must whir, whir, clock will strike, cling, clang, this way, that way, tired of ticking all the day, bing, bang, and Mouse King scare away, whir, whir, purr, purr." Maria stared at Godfather Drosselmeyer, for he did not look at all as he usually did, but appeared much uglier, and he moved his right arm backward and forward, like a puppet pulled by wires. She would have been afraid of him if her mother had not been present, and if Fred had not slipped in the meanwhile, and interrupted him with loud laughter. "Ha ha, Godfather Drosselmeyer," cried Fred, "you are today too droll again. You act just like my harlequin that I threw into the lumber room long ago." But their mother was very serious and said, "Dear counselor, this is very strange sport. What do you really mean by it?" "Gracious me," replied Drosselmeyer, laughing, "have you forgotten, then, my pretty watchmaker's song? I always sing it to such patients as Maria." With this he drew his chair close to her bed, and said, "Do not be angry that I did not pick out the Mouse King's 14 eyes. That could not be, but instead I have in store for you a very agreeable surprise." The counselor, with these words, put his hand in his pocket, drew something out slowly, and behold, it was Nutcracker, with his lost teeth nicely fastened in, and his lame chin well set and sound. Maria cried aloud with joy, while her mother smiled and said, "You see now, Maria, that Godfather Drosselmeyer meant well by your little Nutcracker." "But still you must confess, Maria," said the counselor, "that Nutcracker's figure is none of the finest. Neither can his face be called exactly handsome. How this ugliness came to be hereditary in the family, I will now relate to you, if you will listen. Or perhaps you know already the story of the Princess Pirlipat and the Lady Mouserings and the skillful watchmaker." "Look here, Godfather Drosselmeyer," interrupted Fred. "Nutcracker's teeth you have fastened in very well, and his chin is no longer lame and rickety. But why has he no sword? Why have you not put on his sword?" "Ah," replied the counselor angrily, "you must always meddle and make, you rogue. What is Nutcracker's sword to me? I have cured his wounds, and he may find a sword for himself as he can." "That's true," said Fred. "He is a brave fellow, and will know how to get one." "Tell me then, Maria," continued the counselor, "have you heard the story of the Princess Pirlipat?" "I hope, dear counselor," said the mother, "that your story will not be frightful, as those that you narrate usually are." "By no means, dearest madam," replied Drosselmeyer. "On the contrary, what I have this time the honor to relate is droll and merry." Begin then, dear godfather," cried the children, and the counselor began as follows. The story of the hard nut. Pirlipat's mother was the wife of a king, and therefore a queen, and Pirlipat straightway at the moment of her birth a true princess. The king was beside himself with joy when he saw his beautiful daughter as she lay in the cradle. He shouted aloud, danced, jumped about upon one leg, and cried again and again, "Ha ha! Was there ever anything seen more beautiful than my little Perlipat?" Thereupon all the ministers, generals, presidents, and staff officers jumped about upon one leg like the king, and cried aloud, "No, never!" And it was so, in truth, for as long as the world has been standing, a lovelier child was never born than this very Princess Perlipat. Her little face seemed made of lilies and roses, delicate white and red. Her eyes were of living sparkling azure, and it was charming to see how her little locks curled in bright golden ringlets. Besides this, Perlipat had brought into the world 2 rows of little pearly teeth, with which 2 hours after her birth she bit the High Chancellor's finger, as he was examining her features too closely, so that he screamed out, "Oh, Gemini!" Others assert that he screamed out, "Oh, Cricky!" But on this point authorities are, at the present day, divided. Well, little Perlipat bit the High Chancellor's finger, and the enraptured land knew now that some sense dwelt in Perlipat's beautiful body. As has been said, all were delighted. The queen alone was very anxious and uneasy, and no one knew wherefore, but everybody marked, with surprise, the care with which she watched Perlipat's cradle. Besides that, the doors were guarded by soldiers, and not counting the 2 nurses, who always remained close by the cradle, 6 maids, night after night, sat in the room to watch. But what seemed very foolish, and no one could understand the meaning of it, was this. Each of these 6 maids must have a cat upon her lap, and stroke it the whole night through, and thus keep it continually purring. It is impossible that you, dear children, can guess why a Perlipat's mother made all these arrangements, but I know, and will straightway tell you. It happened that once upon a time many great kings and fine princes were assembled at the court of Perlipat's father, on which occasion much splendor was displayed. The theaters were crowded, balls were given, and tournaments held almost every day. The king, in order to show plainly that he was in no want of gold and silver, was resolved to take a good handful out of his royal treasury and expend it in a suitable manner. Therefore, as soon as he had been privately informed by the overseer of the kitchen that the court astronomer had predicted the right time for killing, he ordered a great feast of sausages, leaped into his carriage, and went himself to invite the assembled kings and princes to take a little soup with him, in order to enjoy the agreeable surprise which he had prepared for them. Upon his return, he said very affectionately to the queen, "You know, my dear, how extremely fond I am of sausages." The queen knew at once what he meant by that, and it was this, that she should take upon herself, as she had often done before, the useful occupation of making sausages. The Lord Treasurer must straightway bring to the kitchen the great golden sausage kettle, and the silver chopping knives and stew pans. A large fire of sandalwood was made. The queen put on her damask apron, and soon the sweet smell of the sausage meat began to steam up out of the kettle. The agreeable odor penetrated even to the royal council chamber, and the king, seized with a sudden transport, could no longer restrain himself. "With your permission, my lords," he cried, and leaped up, ran as fast as he could into the kitchen, embraced the queen, stirred a little with his golden scepter in the kettle, and then, his emotion being quieted, returned calmly to the council. The important moment had now arrived when the fat was to be chopped up into little pieces and browned gently in the silver stew pans. The maids of honor now retired, for the queen, out of true devotion and reverence for her royal spouse, wished to perform this duty alone. But just as the fat began to fry, a small whispering voice was heard. "Give me a little of the fat, sister. I should like my part of the feast. I too am a queen. Give me a little of the fat." The queen knew very well that it was Lady Mouserings who said this. Lady Mouserings had lived these many years in the king's palace. She maintained that she was related to the royal family, and that she was herself a queen in the kingdom of Mousalia, for which reason she held a great court under the hearth. The queen was a kind and benevolent lady, and although she was not exactly willing to acknowledge Lady Mouserings as a true queen and sister, yet she was very ready to allow her a little banquet on this great holiday. She answered, "Therefore, come out then, Lady Mouserings. You are welcome to a little of the fat." Upon this, Lady Mouserings leaped out very quickly and merrily, jumped upon the hearth, and seized with her dainty little paws one piece of fat after the other, as the queen reached it to her. But now all the cousins and aunts of the Lady Mouserings came running out, besides her 7 sons, rude and forward rogues, who all fell at once upon the fat, and the terrified queen could not drive them away. But as good fortune would have it, the chief maid of honor came in at this moment, and chased away the intruding guests, so that a little of the fat was left. The king's mathematician, being summoned, demonstrated very clearly that there was enough remaining to season all the sausages if distributed with the nicest judgment and skill. Drums and trumpets were now heard without, and all the invited potentates and princes, some in white palfreys, some in crystal carriages, came in splendid apparel to the sausage feast. The king received them kindly and graciously, and then, adorned with crown and scepter, as became the monarch of the land, seated himself at the head of the table. Already in the first course, that of the sausage balls, it was observed that he grew pale and paler, raised his eyes to heaven, gentle sighs escaped from his bosom, and he seemed to undergo great inward suffering. But in the second course, which consisted of the long sausages, he sank back upon his throne, sobbing and moaning, held both hands to his face, and at last wept and groaned aloud. All sprang up from the table. The royal physician tried in vain to feel the pulse of the unhappy monarch. A deep-seated, unknown torture appeared to agitate him. At last, after much anxiety, and after the application of some very strong remedies, the king seemed to come a little to himself, and stammered out scarce audibly the words, "Too little fat." That is the most dramatic king I have ever heard of. Oh man, that's hilarious. That is hilarious. Then the queen threw herself in despair at his feet and sobbed out, "Oh, my poor unhappy royal husband! Alas, how great must be the suffering which you endure! But see the guilty one at your feet. Punish her without mercy. Alas, Lady Mouserings with her 7 sons and aunts and cousins have eaten up the fat," and with these words she fell right over backwards in a swoon. Then the king, full of rage, leaped up and cried out, "Chief maid of honor, how happened that?" The chief maid of honor told the story, as much as she knew of it, and the king resolved to take vengeance upon Lady Mouserings and her family for having eaten up the fat of his sausages. The privy council was called, and it was resolved to summon Lady Mouserings to trial and confiscate all her estates. But as the king was of opinion that in the meanwhile she might eat up more of his sausage fat, the affair was placed at last in the hands of the royal watchmaker and his mechanist. This man, whose name was the same as mine, to wit, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, engaged by means of a very singular and deep political scheme to drive Lady Mouserings and her family from the palace forever. He invented, therefore, several curious little machines in which a piece of toasted fat was fastened to a thread, and these Drosselmeyer placed around Lady Mousering's dwelling. Lady Mouserings was much too wise not to see through Drosselmeyer's craft, but all her warnings, all her entreaties were of no avail. Every one of her 7 sons and many of her cousins and aunts went into Drosselmeyer's machines, and as they tried to snap away the fat, were caught by an iron grating, which fell suddenly down behind them, and were afterwards miserably slaughtered in the kitchen. Lady Mouserings, with the little remnant of her family, forsook the dreadful place. Grief, despair, revenge filled her bosom. The court revelled in joy at this event, but the queen was very anxious, for she knew the disposition of Lady Mouserings, and was very sure that she would not suffer the death of her sons to go unavenged. In fact, Lady Mouserings appeared one day when the queen was in the kitchen, preparing harslet hash. I have no idea what harslet hash is. Going to have to look that one up. For her royal husband, a dish of which he was very fond, and said, "My sons, my cousins and aunts are destroyed. Take care, queen, that mouse queen does not bite thy little princess in 2. Take good care." With this she disappeared, and was not seen again. But the queen was so frightened that she let the hash fall into the fire, and thus a second time Lady Mouserings spoiled a favourite dish for the king, at which he was very angry. "But this, dear children," said Drosselmeyer, "is enough for tonight. The rest at another time." Maria, who had her own thoughts about this story, begged Godfather Drosselmeyer very hard to go on, but she could not prevail upon him. He rose, saying, "Too much at once is bad for the health. The rest tomorrow." As the councillor was just stepping out of the room, Fred called out, "Tell me, Godfather Drosselmeyer, is it then really true that you invented mouse-traps?" "How can you ask such a silly question?" said his mother. But the councillor smiled mysteriously and said in an undertone, "Am I a skillful watchmaker and yet not able to invent a mouse-trap?" The story of the hard nut continued. "You know now, children," commenced Councillor Drosselmeyer on the following evening, "why the queen took such care in guarding the beautiful Princess Pirlipat. Was it not to be feared that Lady Mouserings would execute her threat, that she would come again and bite the little princess to death? Drosselmeyer's machines were not the least protection against the wise and prudent Lady Mouserings, but the court astronomer, who was at the same time private stargazer and fortune-teller to his majesty, declared it to be his opinion that the family of Baron Purr would be able to keep Lady Mouserings from the cradle. Most of that name were secretaries of legation at court, with little to do, though always at hand for an embassy to a foreign power. But they must now render themselves useful at home, and thus it came that each of the waiting women must hold a son of that family upon her lap, and by continual and attentive fondling, lighten the severe public duties which fell to their lot. Late one night, the 2 chief nurses who sat close by the cradle started up out of a deep sleep. All around lay in quiet slumber, no purring, the stillness of the grave. Even the death watch could be heard ticking, and what was the terror of the 2 chief waiting women as they just saw before them a large, dreadful mouse, which stood erect upon its hind feet, and had laid its ugly head close against the face of the princess. With a cry of terror they jumped up, all awoke, but in a moment Lady Mouserings, for the great mouse by Pirlipat's cradle was no one but she, ran as fast as she could to the corner of the chamber. The secretaries of legation leaped after her, but too late. She had disappeared through a hole in the chamber floor. Little Pirlipat awoke at the noise and wept bitterly. "Thank heaven," cried the nurse. "She lives! She lives!" But how great was their terror when they looked at Pirlipat and saw what a change had taken place in the sweet, beautiful child. Instead of the white and red face with golden locks, A large ill-shaped head sat upon her thin, shriveled body. Her azure blue eyes were changed into green, staring ones, and her little mouth had stretched itself from ear to ear. The queen was brought to death's door by grief and sorrow, and it was found necessary to hang the king's library with thick-wadded tapestry, for again and again he ran his head against the wall, crying out at every time in lamentable tones, "Ah me, unhappy monarch!" He might now have seen how much better it would have been to eat his sausages without fat, and to leave Lady Mouserings and her family at peace under the hearth. But Pirlipat's royal father did not think about this. He laid all the blame upon the court watchmaker and mechanist, Christian Elias Drosselmeyer of Nuremberg. He therefore wisely decreed that Drosselmeyer should restore the Princess Pirlipat to her former condition within 4 weeks, or at least find out some certain and infallible method of effecting this. Otherwise he should suffer a shameful death under the axe of the executioner. Drosselmeyer was not a little terrified, but he had great confidence in his skill and good fortune, and began immediately the first operation which he thought useful. He took little Princess Pirlipat apart with great dexterity, unscrewed her, little hands and feet, and carefully examined her inward structure. But he found, alas, that the princess would grow uglier as she grew bigger, and knew not what to do or what to advise. He put the princess carefully together again, and sank down by her cradle in despair, for he was not allowed to leave it. The 4th week had commenced. Yes, Thursday had come. The king looked in with flashing eyes, and shaking his scepter at him, cried, "Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, cure the princess, or thou must die." Drosselmeyer began to weep bitterly, but the Princess Pirlipat lay as happy as the day, and cracked nuts. Pirlipat's uncommon appetite for nuts now occurred for the first time to the mechanist, and the fact likewise that she had come into the world with teeth. In truth, immediately after her transformation, she had screamed continually until a nut accidentally came in her way, which she immediately put into her mouth, cracked it, ate the kernel, and then became quite composed. Since that time her nurses found that nothing pleased her so well as to be supplied with nuts. O sacred instinct of nature, eternal, inexplicable sympathy of existence, cried Christian Elias Drosselmeyer, thou pointest me to the gates of this mystery. I will knock and they will open. He begged straightway for permission to speak with the royal astronomer, and was led to his apartment under a strong guard. They embraced with many tears, for they had been warm friends, then retired into a private cabinet, and examined a great many books which treated of instinct, of sympathies and antipathies, and other mysterious things. Night came on. The astronomer looked at the stars, and with the aid of Drosselmeyer, who had great skill in such matters, set up the horoscope of Princess Pirlipat. It was a great deal of trouble, for the lines grew all the while more and more intricate. But at last, what joy! At last it became clear that the Princess Pirlipat, in order to be freed from the magic which had deformed her, and to regain her beauty, had nothing to do but to eat the kernel of the nut Crackatuck. Now the nut Crackatuck had such a hard shell that an 840-pounder might be wheeled over it without breaking it. This hard nut must be cracked with the teeth before the princess by a man who had never been shaved and had never worn boots. The young man must then hand her the kernel with closed eyes, and must not open them again until he had marched 7 steps backward without stumbling. Drosselmeyer and the astronomer had labored together without cessation for 3 days and nights, and the king was seated at dinner on Sunday afternoon, when the mechanist, who was to have been beheaded early Monday morning, rushed in with joy and transport, and proclaimed that he had found out a method of restoring to the Princess Pirlipat her lost beauty. The king embraced him with great kindness and promised him a diamond sword, 4 orders of honor, and 2 new Sunday suits. Immediately after dinner, we will go to work, he added, and see to it, dear mechanist, that the unshorn young man in shoes is ready at hand with the Nutcracker, and take care that he drinks no wine beforehand, for fear he should stumble as he goes the 7 steps backward like a crab. Afterward he may drink like a fish. Drosselmeyer was very much discomposed at these words, and after much stuttering and stammering, said that the method was discovered indeed, but that the Nutcracker and the young man to crack it were yet to be sought after, and that it was quite doubtful whether Nut or Nutcracker would ever be found. The king, in great anger, swung his scepter about his crowned head and roared with the voice of a lion, "Then off goes thy head!" It was very fortunate for the unhappy Drosselmeyer that the king's dinner had been cooked better than usual this day, so that he was in a pleasant humor and disposed to listen to reason, while the good queen, who was moved by the hard fate of the mechanist, used her influence to soothe him. Drosselmeyer then, after a while, took courage and represented to the monarch that he had performed his task in discovering the means to restore the princess to her beauty, and thus, by the terms of the royal decree, had secured his safety. The king said that was all trash, stupid stuff and nonsense, but resolved at last that the watchmaker should leave the court instantly, accompanied by the royal astronomer, and never return without the Nutcracker in his pocket. By the intercession of the queen, he consented that the Nutcracker might be summoned by a notice in all the home, foreign newspapers, and journals. Here the counselor broke off again and promised to narrate the rest on the following evening. Well, my friends, that is where we're going to end for today. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. And now, at the end of this video, you will see the playlist of all the classic tales of Christmas we have done thus far. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again soon. You have been watching ASMR Sleep. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell to get all future content. Thank you for watching. See you next time.